We're finishing the book of Nehemiah today. We're up to chapter 13. And when we began, the introduction was Nehemiah was going to be rebuilding the walls and rebuilding the people. And you think the job is done. My mother-in-law would always say a parent's job is never done. And Nehemiah is not recorded he had any children, but he dealt with the people of Judah as his own children. So chapters 1 through 12, the walls are built, the gates are rehung, the word is read and understood, the people are committed. What could possibly go wrong? I guess I'll go back to Persia. Well, he goes back to Persia and finds out that just like parenting, his job is never done either. And we're going to see some things in the chapter that I would not recommend in terms of behavior, because he's going to get physical with some people. But I would recommend that we deal with reforms with the same spirit. 1 Corinthians says this: be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men. We could spend the entire morning on just those three words. Act like men, be strong. That doesn't mean be a caveman, but this is the punchline. Let all that you do be done in love. So, Nehemiah 13, only Jews allowed. On that day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. We don't know exactly what day was that day, but in that day, they're reading from the book of Moses, and they discover something there. And it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. Straight from Deuteronomy. Now, that rock on the right-hand side, the archaeologists found that rock, and that rock was on the Herod's Temple Mount, and it says in 3 different languages, no Gentiles allowed. It's an extension of the law, just like so many other things. There was the law, and then there were all of the traditions. By the time you go from Deuteronomy to Nehemiah to 29 BC, they went from no Ammonites and no Moabites to no Gentiles at all. And we'll expand on that when we see a model of the Herod's Temple courts. Why are the Ammonites and the Moabites singled out? They did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but they hired Balaam, the false prophet, against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. And as soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent, except you know who. Now, who might that be? We're going to find out right now. So there is a model of the temple court. If there was an aerial photograph of that today, there would be the Dome of the Rock there. You see on the left side, which also continues over to the right side, the court of the Gentiles. That whole thing was established as an extension of not the Moabites and not the Ammonites, and not because they didn't believe in Jehovah, because if that were the case, it would have been all the Gentiles. It was because they did the thing with Balaam and the donkey. And so how did that extension impact people like Paul? When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing Paul in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. Paul was certainly allowed in the temple. He was a Pharisee, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law in this place." Well, he was not teaching against the law. He was teaching about the fruition of the law, that is to say, Jesus Christ. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple, Gentiles, and has defiled this holy place, not because the guy was there, but they saw him in town, and they extended the thing. And just like Jesus got railroaded through the Sanhedrin and Herod and Pilate, Paul gets railroaded. And this is what caused him to be taken out of Jerusalem all the way to the coast and ultimately to Italy to his ministry there and his death. So see how stretching a law could impact things, adding to the word of God. Now, before they read what was in the law, this is what was happening. Keep in mind, it was just chapter 10 where all these guys signed the covenant that they were going to keep the law. And we're going to find that in just 3 chapters, they broke every specific that was spelled out in chapter 10. Moreover, before this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, remember Tobiah the Ammonite, back to Deuteronomy 23, the Ammonite, he prepared for him an apartment. He prepared for him a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, the tithes of grain, the wine, the oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites. Remember, the Levites weren't given any specific piece of ground. They were allowed to live in villages. They were allowed to have their own victory gardens, but they didn't have any land per se. And so this food was set aside for them. They took all the food, all of the trappings for worship, that is to say, the frankincense, they threw it all out, and they gave Tobiah an apartment inside the temple. And while this was taking place, Nehemiah was not in Jerusalem. Remember in chapters 1 and 2, he asked for leave of Artaxerxes, and the king said to him, sure, you can go, but what is your appointed time for you to come back? Well, he may have said 12 years because it was 12 years and he's now back in Persia. Now, while this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. Now it says king of Babylon, but he was the king of the entire Persian Empire. Many times when they said Babylon, they meant the whole thing. And after some time, I asked the king for leave to come back and visit Jerusalem again. And I then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. Now, he didn't take up a committee. He didn't ask for a vote. He took the situation into his own hands. But before we get there, there's an application I want to make here. I'm sure each of you have seen that commercial, many commercials, Capital One. What's in your wallet? Well, I'm going to change that and say, what's in your temple? Now, 1 Corinthians, we read, what? Know you not that your bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit? Well, I'm going to expand that to mean just not your body, but your heart, not the anatomical heart, but the innermost part of you, body, soul, and spirit. What are you holding dear to you? The old-fashioned preacher would say, show me your checkbook and I'll show you what your priorities are. Well, there's very few checks out of my checkbook because it's all electronic. So what's in your wallet? We're going to find they didn't just clear out the chamber. Because they cleared out the chamber, and because the people, the Levites and the singers and the gatekeepers weren't given their due, the people stopped giving. Now, we don't know which came first. They stopped giving. They cleared it out back and forth. But the point I want to make is this. First question is, what's in your wallet? What's in your temple? What are your priorities? And then feeding, what are your objectives? So what's in your wallet? There's another commercial. I was shocked to find that this commercial, this byline, first came out in the 70s. It's 50 years old. Don't leave home without it. Well, I'm going to change that commercial as well. Don't leave home without it. Now, if you're like me, you don't go very far without this thing. And I've got 2 copies of the Bible on this thing, okay? But that's not where this is taught. It's supposed to be here. Thy word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin against thee. Not just on Sundays, not just at the home front, but everywhere we go. Don't leave home without it. What's in your wallet? So Tobiah was very angry, and he took the situation into his own hands. He threw out the household furniture of Tobiah, his chest of drawers, his dirty underwear, his toothbrush, everything. He cleared house. And then I gave orders, and they cleaned the place up. They cleaned the chambers, and they brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. Now, if they threw out all the old stuff, where did the replacement stuff come from? That's where we're going to come. There are three more reforms that we're going to cover in chapter 13, and everyone addresses a specific thing they all signed up for. Chapter 10 even mentions the names, and every one of them said, we're not going to be doing that. So they replaced those things in the chambers with new tithes and free will offerings coming from the people. I also found that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and singers who did the work had fled each to his field. Now, my Rebecca came up with this great line. She has a serious problem. It's called volunteerism. And she finally came up with this line that says, every time I say yes, I have to say no. Every time you agree to one thing, you have to turn something else loose. We each only have 24/7, and that's it, right? So if the Levites had to go back to their own gardening and their own farming, what did they give up? They gave up their work around the sanctuary. And the same thing happens here. It's very easy to get away from 94.5 on the radio and listen to something different. It's very easy to give up on your daily Bible study and check out the news on your phone. Had to come back in terms of what's in your wallet. So the Levites and the singers were supposed to do their thing, but instead they're out taking care of their families. So I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and I set them in their stations. I said, look, there's your workstation. You better get busy. And then all of Judah brought the tithes of the grain, the wine, and the oil. And I highlighted that because I showed you earlier in the chapter, it's those very things that got thrown out. They had to be replaced. So the people had to have their hearts where they were supposed to be. And the Levites could put their hearts, their tasks, their time where they were supposed to be. And I love this quote. Paul said, I seek not what is yours, but I seek you. There was a missionary that came to church where I was attending at the time, and he said, there's two things I ask of you. Your money and your prayers. If you're honest with your prayers, I might get some of your money. I seek not what is yours, but you. And so he's got the chamber back where it's supposed to be. The house is going to stay there. He had to put some stewards in place. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah of the Levites, and as their assistant Hanan the son of Zechur, son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable. ESV uses the word reliable. King James uses the word faithful. I like that one because it ties to 1 Corinthians. It says, moreover, it is required of stewards that a person be found faithful. Now, we're going to come back to those names in just a second. They were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Borrow from Ephesians. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. Now, those are the names that we just read about. These are their meanings. And just like the gates, there was a sequence of events, there's a sequence of events here as well. Hanan means grace. And by grace you're saved by faith, not of yourself. When I was saved, I was redeemed. I was brought back, and I was justified. And because I've been saved and because I'm justified, I can repay to God through a clean life. And so that's what's happening right here in Nehemiah chapter 13. Remember me. Now, in chapter 13, remember as we introduced the book, we said that Nehemiah was a man of prayer. We had a list of all of his different prayers. We matched it with the prayer requests of Paul. We mentioned that it should be a prayer request not just of Nehemiah, not just for Paul, but also for our pastors. But in chapter 13, 4 times he says the prayer, remember me. Now, that does mean that he left God's memory. Nothing leaves God's memory. God knows the end from the beginning. The definition of remember and forgot in terms of God is if they say God forgot something, that means he did not take action. If it says God remembers something, it means God took action. Greatest example, Genesis chapter 6, the Bible says, and God remembered Noah. It wasn't like by the time we get to chapter 6, oh yeah, Noah, I forgot all about him. No, he took action. So what Nehemiah is saying these 4 times is he's saying, God, take some action here. And he's saying, God, remember this situation. Do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. You know, we're in the New Testament, we're in the church age times, and if you've been saved, it's not a question of heaven or hell. I'm secure in my faith. I know in whom I believed. It's a question of crowns or not. And I could be eligible for, crown A on day 1, and then I can blow it. I can just ruin everything. Paul prayed that he would not be a castaway. In another section, he said, don't let their faith be shipwreck. And what Nehemiah is saying here, he's saying, God, I know I did the right thing, but don't, back to that verse that we read from 1 Corinthians 16, don't let it get out of hand and don't let me do it not in the spirit of love. Don't let me do it in such a way that I could hurt somebody else. Don't let me ruin my testimony with you or with those that are around me. Reformation number 2. In those days, I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine and grapes and figs and all kinds of loads. Now, when you read the Gospels, the Pharisees picked on Jesus at one point. They said that he was working when he made some spit to heal the blind man. That's not law. That was extension. Here they're breaking the law. He said, I'm seeing people doing some heavy duty stuff. And they're bringing all this stuff to sell it in Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on that day when they were selling the food. Foreigners who also lived in the city, they shouldn't have been there, foreigners who also lived in the city brought fish and all kinds of goods and sold them to the people on the Sabbath in Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the leaders. As the leaders go, so go the people. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this? What is this evil thing that you're doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way? What was the reason there was a Babylonian captivity in the first place? The people had violated the Sabbath for 490 days. In this case, it was the 7th year was supposed to be the land at rest. So 1 out of 7 for the 490 years, they had to give up 1 out of 7. They lost 70 years because of that. And he's saying, you want us to fall into that trap again? You're going to bring more wrath on Israel. Haven't you learned your lesson? As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors be shut. Now, the doors were already shut every day. If you remember one of the earlier chapters, Hannah and Hananiah were supposed to lock the doors and not open them again until the sun rose up. Well, Same situation here. They're locking the doors. No big deal. The difference is on the Sabbath, on every other day, they opened those doors up when the sun was high in the sky, and in came the merchants. This time he's saying, lock the doors and keep them locked. I commanded the doors be shut and that they would not be opened again till after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants, his servants, because he wasn't sure what was going on inside of Jerusalem. Maybe everybody went derelict. So he stationed his own servants there that no load might be brought into the Sabbath day. And this goes back to Exodus. See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. This goes back to the time of manna. They're supposed to pick enough manna Friday to satisfy them for 2 days. If they did a double batch on Thursday, by Friday it would be rotten, but not so on Sabbath. And look at this. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day. Now, we covered the Sabbath a couple weeks ago, and the Sabbath really is not meant for the New Testament people. You're supposed to decide in your own hearts. But I will tell you, it's a wholesome thing when you observe an observant Jew family on a Sabbath. They don't go anywhere. They stay home. They read their Torah. They have family time. They truly rest. Now, just like so many other things, they go overboard. They don't cook. They set their crock pots on a timer. They don't deal with their light switches. They're on timers. If you visit CHOP or Children's Hospital, they have Sabbath elevators where you don't have to push a button to go to a floor. They just automatically stop on every single floor. It's an overboard situation, and you'll see that again and again and again. But in this case, it has nothing to do with tradition. It has nothing to do with going overboard. They were breaking the Sabbath. Now, the merchants and the sellers of all kinds of wares, they park outside the gates, waiting for the gates to wake up the next day. And just like, some people, when there's this big sale, they'll go and they'll park themselves outside the closed doors, like maybe Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. People are ready to go. Well, these merchants, this is the Black Friday in reverse. The store is ready to come out. The merchants are there at the store ready to go out, and they don't open the doors. So Nehemiah shows up and he says, I warned them and I said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. They knew he meant business. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember, this is prayer number 2, remember this also in my favor, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. Why does God need steadfast love? I'll speak in first person. Because I trip all the time, again and again and again. And Nehemiah is saying, okay, I did another good thing for you today, but God, keep it up. Keep me on the straight and narrow. Reformation number 3. In those days, I also saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab from the west and the south and the east. And half of the children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And we talked about intermarriage as one of the covenant things a few weeks ago. And here we have a drift. Now, if you recall the last 2 chapters of Ezra cleaned house. He said, you Levites, you can't go into the priesthood because your genealogy is tainted. He cleaned shop. Well, now we're moving 55, 60 years later, and it's already been tarnished. And we'll see the grandson of one of those guys intermarried. We also mentioned that it was not a question of different cultures or different races. We're all of human race. It was a question of faith. And we're going to see here the same situation. it's coming back again to faith, and he's going to use as an example Solomon and his many wives and how those wives diluted his faith. But he's mentioning a cultural issue here. They didn't just forget how to speak like Jewish people, they could only speak the other language. Now, we have an interesting cultural mix here. You have Latinos with Americans, and I'll tell you what, I'm very jealous of people that are bilingual. I don't know how they do it. You know, I've mentioned several times I'm of Slovak descent. And if you study, there are, as a percentage basis, fewer Slovak descendants who speak the native language than anybody else. That was because we were so big on the melting pot idea back around the early 1900s? No. It was because of discrimination. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this. My grandfather supported the building of 2 churches because when he wanted to go and worship at a church, he was stoned by other whites, not Slovaks. And so the idea was, if you can get rid of that language, if you can get rid of that accent, you might not be a second-class citizen. But in this case, all their writings were in Hebrew. There was no translation. There was no Rosetta Stone. There was no Chat GPT. And so there was a nervousness there that they're going to lose their culture. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. That wouldn't feel so good. Keep in mind, for Jesus, they said they plucked the beard out of his face. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters to your sons or to yourselves. You know, no big deal, because 3 chapters earlier, they put the oath in writing. Didn't Solomon, the king, notice back there it says, even him. So first of all, I've got one wonderful wife. I can't handle any more than one. He had 1,000 between wives and concubines. And even him, the wisest man that ever was, got pulled aside. And he's saying, if this wise guy can be pulled aside, we common guys, we don't have a chance. So stay close. Follow the bouncing ball. To make matters worse, the high priest's grandson married Sanballat's daughter. So you see this intermarriage at the highest level. As the leaders go, so go the people. So here he comes again, prayer number 3. Remember them. It's a different prayer now. He's asking them to take action there because they desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Well, I have a pastor, not a priest. I don't need a priest because the Bible calls me a priest. And I'm not supposed to desecrate myself. We're not supposed to desecrate ourselves, nor our office. Thus I cleanse them from everything foreign, the priesthood, the Sabbath, the intermarriage, and I established the duties, each in his own work, and I provided the wood offerings at the appointed times and for the first fruits. And remember me, O God, for good. And that's where Nehemiah ends. Our next book is Esther. Esther, the entire book is only about 5,000 words. And if I read it at the speed at which I read some of the verses here, it would only take a little over half an hour to read. So I'm going to encourage each and every one of you to read it somewhere in the next week. If you break it up, you have 5 minutes a day and you've got the whole thing read by the time we're together again. By the way, there are no long lists of names in Esther, so you don't have to worry about that. The picture there is a picture of a book by Chuck Swindoll, Esther, a Woman of Strength and Dignity. Now, I would encourage you to read the book of Esther, and if it really has an interest for you, go ahead and get that book. You can find it on Insight for Living. You can find it on Amazon. There are several copies used on Biblio. There's a copy in the church library, because you're going to get a little bit deeper insight in the book of Esther. And we're going to be following, as our normal course, verse by verse. But we're also going to be pulling some insights for living out of that particular book. Chuck also goes and he charts out every single book of scripture, and Esther is no exception. We're going to pull some of those things together. First of all, Christ in Esther. Christ can be found in every book of scripture, even though the word God is not mentioned in Esther whatsoever. Esther was an advocate, willing to die. Christ is an advocate, and he in fact died. Christ in you, the hope of glory. Second of all, when you read the book of Esther, yes, it's a great narrative. You could make a play on this. Shakespeare couldn't write a play with more intrigue than the book of Esther. But what comes out of the book is the extraordinary thing that God can do with ordinary people. And so here's the storyline. The storyline goes like this. Chapter 1, there are 3 parties. King Ahasuerus has a party for 180 days. Imagine the hangover. Maybe they didn't have an hangover because day 1 just flowed right into day 2. And then when that was done, they had an after party of 7 days. And the men can't stay away from home that long, so the women had their own party. And at one point, Vashti, the queen, was asked to come in and dance, and she said, no, thank you very much. And she loses her position as queen. Ahasuerus decides to have a beauty pageant. There were 127 provinces. So they said, find one fair virgin from every one of those provinces and bring them together and let the king choose who should be the next queen. And that is where we introduce Esther. In that same chapter, Mordecai, her cousin, uncovers a plot to kill the king. Chapter 3. Haman, who's the prime minister of Persia, he expects everybody to bow down to him. In fact, the king ordered that everybody should bow down to him. And Mordecai said, I'm not doing it. I only bow down to God. And so Haman puts together a conspiracy to have all the Jews killed. And he throws some dice, the pur, that's die, single dice. Purim is the plural of pur. That's where they get the feast of Purim. They cast the pur to choose what the day was going to be when all the Jews get killed. So when that happens, there's a party in the palace and there's mourning in the streets because the message went out by Pony Express to all 127 provinces, the Jews are going to die. Chapter 5, Esther goes before the king. For such a time as this, she was born. And there was a law that says, if you go before the king without being invited, you're going to die. And she says, if I perish, I perish, because she wasn't invited. Chapter 6, the king says to her in chapter 5, well, what can I do for you? And she says, let's have a banquet. Invite your prime minister along with. And the prime minister is very proud of going to have an exclusive dinner with the king and his wife. But he was so upset that Mordecai wouldn't bow down. And his wife says, well, I know how to take care of Mordecai. Just hang him and then go enjoy the dinner. That night, Ahasuerus can't sleep. He reads about Mordecai and the plot. And in the morning, Ahasuerus orders Haman to honor Mordecai. He goes home after leading Mordecai through the city on a horse wearing the king's robes. And he's saying to his missus, his boy had a miserable day at the office. You can't believe what happened to me. And Mrs. says, if that's what happened, too bad for you. So they come to dinner the second time. Esther pleads for the lives of the Jews, and Haman is hanged on his own gallows. Remember when we were reading Daniel that the law in the Medes and the Persians could not be reversed? Well, the king wrote a law that the kings were going to die and he couldn't repeal it. So they had to do something different. So they came up with a corollary to that law to preclude it, and the Jews were saved. The Jews rout their enemies. Haman is hanged on his own gallows. His 10 sons are killed, and Mordecai establishes the Feast of Purim. And when we read this epitaph from chapter 10, I want you to think of the first time Sanballat was upset with Naaman. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus. And he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people. That was the very reason Sanballat was upset with Nehemiah before the walls even started construction. Nehemiah sought the welfare of his people, and Mordecai spoke peace to all his people. And so we have this benediction. It's not the end of the class. I got 7 more minutes. We have this benediction. Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. We're going to see the depths of his riches because God's name is not even mentioned in these scriptures. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. When you read those chapters, you're going to see, quote unquote, coincidence after coincidence, time and time again. What are the key verses that are inside Esther? First of all, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. Mordecai is trying to convince Esther to go into the king and plead for her people. And he says, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise up for the Jews. It had to, because if they kill all the Jews, there'll be no bloodline for Jesus. But you and your fathers will perish. And who knows whether you have not come for the kingdom for such a time as this. We have that exact same thing every opportunity we have to live for Jesus. You were born for such a time as this. And then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in the capital and hold a fast. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women will also fast. Then I'll go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. She was facing the penalty of death by appearing before the king. Yet we, many times, will not open our mouths, given an opportunity to speak for Jesus, for fear of a dirty look, a non-reception. Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the glorious gospel of Christ, which is the power of God unto salvation to those that believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. The other key verse is this, and we already read it. He sought the welfare of the people, and he spoke peace, shalom. The message for Haman, I'll bless them that bless thee. Notice that's plural, and then it comes to single, and I'll curse him that curses thee. I'll bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. I'm going to make a comment about current events. I don't know what's in the memo of understanding between the U.S. and Iran. I don't know what's going to happen in U.S. politics, whether it's President Trump or anyone who else is going to follow him. But this verse is still in play. Secondly, I don't know what's going to happen to the nation of Iran. I don't know if that regime is going to fall. I don't know if they'll ever have another nuclear weapon. But if you read Ezekiel chapter 38, Persia named specifically, Persia is the real name for Iran. It wasn't changed to Iran until the 20th century. Persia will yet again attack Israel. So what's the theme of Esther? I already mentioned to you that God is going to do extraordinary things with ordinary people. But I want you to look at this verse from 1 Timothy. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now, that word provide means far more than just putting food on the table and making sure the rent and the utilities are paid. That word provide comes from the Latin pro video, to look ahead. The housekeeper's job, and I'll tell you the most difficult job in the universe is the single mother. The head of the household's job is to look out beyond the immediate so that you can take care of the immediate. Now, I also have some grandparents in the audience. Our job isn't done yet either. We have a different horizon. You know, as you go second story, third story, fourth story, the horizon you can see farther out. We can look beyond. Is the rent paid? Is the food on the table? We can see things, and we should be protecting the family as well. So how does this fit into what we've been studying? There we studied Ezra, and you can see Zerubbabel and Ezra, and there we studied Nehemiah, and right in the middle is the book of Esther. How does that relate to world history?